Okay, I don't think you understand how excited I am about my guest today. He is the author of this book, Dale Bredesen. I have read it cover to cover several times. I'm obsessed with it. I use this all the time, and I can't believe he agreed to be on my show. Here we go. Let me read you his bio. Dr. Bredesen graduated from Caltech and received his MD from Duke. He trained with Nobel laureate Professor Stanley Prusiner and was the founding president of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. His research led to over 230 published papers and the first reversal of cognitive decline in patients with Alzheimer's disease using a precision medicine protocol. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers and is the senior director of the world's first precision medicine program for neurodegenerative diseases at the Pacific Neuroscience Institute. So without further ado, I am so excited to get Dr. Bredesen on this show. Here we go. Hi.
How you doing?
I just can't believe you're on my show.
Good to be here.
I don't know if you understand. I did a little intro before you got here, but I don't know if you understand like how many times I've been through this. And I'm really like fangirling. I don't think I've ever fangirled before, but I think I'm your number one fan. I've used it so many times. I'm so glad you're on the show. Thank you.
I'm great to be here. This is a golden era to me. I spent my whole, I'm 72 now. I spent my whole career telling people there's nothing you can do. Basically went back to the lab with the idea that I would come back to patients if we ever had anything that had any effect, because there hasn't been anything. And we would just tell people, you have Alzheimer's, there's nothing we can do. You have progressive supranuclear palsy, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body disease, CBD. I mean, it was so depressing. I mean, ALS, one of the worst, because they go downhill more quickly. And I just saw so many of these people when I was training and shortly thereafter. So, went back to the lab 100% time with the idea, could we understand these? And what's really exciting is we have a much better understanding of what this is now. Why do you get it? How do you prevent it? How do you reverse it? It's going to be, and now as you know, better blood tests. We have a new program down at Pacific Neuroscience, and new things that we have a bigger clinical trial ongoing. This is a new era, so good timing. Thank you.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. We're going to talk about all of it.
Great. Awesome.
So it sounds like...
Tell me a little bit about how did you start with all this? What got you in this?
So I kind of started similar to you. I have a medical practice, pediatric, adult, geriatric, kind of the typical things. And I had so many people come into me, hey, I don't feel well, I have brain fog, I have joint pain, and I would run the typical test, and I would have to conclude that they're fine. Yeah. Nothing came up with the typical algorithm, and I never really thought anything about it until my wife got sick. She ultimately was diagnosed with autoimmunity, and we just this is before the internet is what it is now, so we just started exploring. And we got into functional medicine, and lo and behold, we discovered that nutrition has to do with autoimmunity. That was crazy.
Yeah.
It's not something that's taught, right? We never taught. Well, how much nutrition did you learn in school?
We had one course at Duke Medical School that was optional. You didn't have to take it.
You didn't have to take it.
And I took it, and I learned one thing, that vitamin C is thermolabile. That's what I learned.
That's it. And if you don't have it, you'll get scurvy.
Yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah, there's so much more now.
Yeah, and so, I remember when they suggested that nutrition might reverse, she has PMLE, reverse PMLE. I was like, this is crazy, but whatever, we have nothing to lose,
Yeah.
And then once I got into the vortex, I just kept going back to school until eventually I got, certified by IFM, I got the PhD, and then I started bringing it back to the world, kind of the same as you're doing. But this Alzheimer's piece, I mean, it blows me away. So tell me a little bit, you kind of said what inspired you? You were just inspired to even think, to just figure out what it is, and then it was an accidental finding?
So what happened was I got interested in the brain when I was 18 years old. I was interested in computers at the time and happened to read a book that's called The Machinery of the Brain by Dean Wooldridge. This is from ancient days, Thomson Ramo Wooldridge, the early engineering company. And then computer-related stuff. And so I read that and I thought, wow, the brain is so fascinating. I kind of got hooked for life. I went to medical school to learn more about it. I then went to neurology residency to learn more about it. But as I went through neurology, it became so clear. Neurology is the area where there's the least therapeutic help. So whether you had a stroke, it's like, okay, you had a stroke, sorry. Alzheimer's, any of the neurodegenerative diseases. So when I was training, and this is way back in the 1980s, it was so clear that neurodegenerative diseases were a field of complete lack of understanding. There's just, you just get these. And I remember you look at the pathology in these brains and you see the Lewy bodies and you see the amyloid plaques and you see the neurofibrillary tangles. And I just thought, you know what? What I'd like to do is leave the clinical side, go into the lab, and let's ask what happened. Because when I was an undergrad, I worked at Caltech and MIT, and we were very much, it was all focused on the lab side. But the thing that bothered me was the stuff we were studying, like, triplet states, didn't have anything to do with making people better. So I thought, if we could apply the sorts of things I learned there, and let's actually look to see what is the fundamental nature of the neurodegenerative process. It's, as you know, it's incredibly common. About 15% of the population dies of Alzheimer's disease. It's now the number 2 killer in the UK. And if you are a woman in the UK, it's the number 1 killer in the UK if you are a woman. So this is incredibly common. And then, just about everybody knows somebody with Alzheimer's. And if it's not Alzheimer's, it's Lewy body, it's frontotemporal dementia, it's progressive supranuclear palsy, on and on and on. It's really sad. And it's been the area of greatest biomedical therapeutic failure. Mm-hmm. So we started studying in the lab just the phenomenon of neural cell death, this whole idea of programmed cell death, how these cells are programming their own demise and how that is activated. Why would you do that? And what became really interesting to me is that people tend to look at these diseases as if something went wrong. Oh, you made amyloid because you're giving yourself Alzheimer's. Well, why? As you well know, the body doesn't do stuff because it's angry at you. The body does stuff because you have exposed it to some insult. And so we wanted to understand, what's the fundamental nature. In fact, I used to go to meetings back when I was still, doing basic research, and still my colleagues would talk to me, and I would say, we want to understand what Alzheimer's actually is. And they would say, well, what do you mean what it actually is? It's misfolded protein, it's aggregated proteins, it's amyloid, it's tau. And it's like, no, we need to understand. And that's why I really, one of my real heroes is Jeffrey Bland, because he really started a form of medicine, functional medicine, that actually asks what is the upstream problem. As they say, what's the root cause? And so what we started to realize is all of these diseases fit best with a model in which they are network insufficiencies. So what's interesting is, you've got this amazing networks throughout your body. And, we understand pretty much about cancer. Cancer, you have the normal oncogenes, the normal tumor suppressor genes, and you get, mutations in the tumor suppressors or to activate the oncogenes, and you get cancer. And you see it again and again and again. Now, of course, there are all sorts of nuances. It has a lot to do with nutrition. It has a lot to do with stress, with toxins, all these things. But fundamentally, we understand the cellular process. And here's what's fascinating. On the cancer side, this is about a gene, or typically genes. When you get a clinical cancer, typically you have about 7 to 9 different genes already that have been mutated. But in neurodegenerative diseases, it's really about the system. And so, for example, you've got this beautiful nervous system with 100 billion nerve cells, 500 trillion synapses, and you have these subnetworks. And why are they at risk? Well, that's the fascinating thing. During evolution, what happened was that repeatedly, evolution selected for performance over durability. And of course, the people who are here now had been selected for performance. So we always think about, my muscles are going to be in good shape. No, these things are operating at the limit. You did everything possible to vanquish your foes 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million years ago. So what happens now, we have these subnetworks. So you have a subnetwork that is all about plasticity, all the different things that are needed, the trophic factors, the synaptic networks, specific nutrients that are needed. And that's operating right on the edge of its ability. You actually can store in your brain 2.5 million gigabytes, equal to a couple thousand home computers, and equal to one of the biggest supercomputers in the world. Inside the skull, it's amazing. So you've got these incredible systems. You've got another subnetwork that's about motor modulation that fine-tunes, and that's the one that goes awry in Parkinson's. And then you have another system that is all about motor power. When you stomp on your gas and you go from just what it took to put your foot down, which is almost nothing, to this massive increase in horsepower, that is over 10,000-fold power amplification in a second or two. Your brain does at least that much when it goes from a thought, I'm going to now activate all my muscles, to the maximum muscle activation. You have this instantaneous change of over 10,000-fold. You go from about a 1/1,000,000th of a calorie per second to about a half a calorie per second. So each of these systems has its own Achilles heel. Each one has supply and demand. And no surprise, as we go through life and we demand more and we supply less, we get in this situation where now these things have to pull back. And we realize the evolution of the aging process, which is antagonistic pleiotropy, was at work. It kept selecting performance over durability. As long as there's light on your retina, your macula is going 1,000,000 miles an hour. And so too much light, too little sleep, too much blue light, any of those things, you are going to increase your risk for macular degeneration. So the great news is this gives us for the first time a framework. And it tells us for each of these things, we must look at all the supply side and all the demand side. We must increase the supply and reduce the demand. And the first person that came to see me in 2012, I wasn't ready to see anybody, but we had actually a clinical trial going, and we were turned down. They said, clinical trial, you can just do one thing. We said, no, that's not the way this disease works. It's a network, okay? You got to do all this stuff. I was all depressed because the person who was going to fund the trial called me up and yelled at me and said, what's wrong with you? You can't get this trial approved. He said, if you worked for me, I would fire you. Thank goodness I don't work for you. So in any case, I got a call from a woman in San Francisco who had a friend who was actually working for the CIA who was struggling. Her mother had died with Alzheimer's. She was struggling. And so she said, would you talk to her about what you were going to do in the trial? And I said, well, look, the trial didn't get funded, but I'm happy to tell her. I thought I would never hear from this person again. So she came out in April of 2012. And I went through, this is how it works. And she's taking all these notes because she can't remember things very well. And I got a call from her. I didn't hear anything for 3 months. I got a call from her 3 months later. And she said, I cannot believe it. I am better than I've been in 30 years. I'm back at work full time. I can remember things. Everything is great. As she said, I got my brain back.
Yeah.
And so, I turned to my wife and said,
this worked?
We were on the right track. This is like she used to laugh at me and say, you're always working on your yellow pad. So I would have this big yellow pad for years, and I would be writing stuff like, what if we did this? What if we did that? Maybe it works like this. Maybe it works like that. What about this? What about that? And so finally I said, look, the yellow pad told us this.
The yellow pad's working.
The yellow pad's working.
This is amazing. So this brings me, I love a few takeaways for our audience. One is understanding this as networks. It's not one thing. It's a network. Right. And I love the supply and demand. You cannot keep demanding, and not giving supply. It's something very easy for us to understand.
Yep.
So these things are on the yellow pad that your patient wrote eventually became the Bredesen protocol, I imagine.
Yeah.
Okay. So
writing over the years. Yeah.
Tell us what the Bredesen protocol is.
Yeah. So as you just indicated, essentially, conceptually, it's simple. It just says, if you recognize what this disease actually is, then you look at the things that are driving it in each person and you address those things. Now, where the diagnosis is helpful, if you have Parkinson's versus Alzheimer's versus Lewy body versus CBD or PSP, it tells you what that subnetwork is. And we can now learn, and this is where we're going to be able over the next few years to define all the important variables for each of these subnetworks. We know most of them now qualitatively, but we don't know them absolutely quantitatively. So the idea is when you look at Alzheimer's, there are 3 things that are too little and 3 things that are too much, the supply versus the demand. The 3 things that are on the bad side, that are where it's giving you too much exposure, inflammation, toxicity, and too much stress, interestingly. The three things that are not enough are the trophic activity, energetics, very, very important, and then the neurotransmitters. So what we're saying is when you have cognitive decline, those are the requirements of that system. If you've got something different, you got to go after a different system, so it's going to be slightly different, but there are fair numbers of overlaps. So look, if you wanted to give someone Alzheimer's, you would ramp up their inflammation, you would ramp up their stress, you would ramp up their exposure to toxins. And that means biotoxins, organics, and inorganics. So, mercury, air pollution, glyphosate, all these sorts of things. And unfortunately, the current mainstream medicine is not even bothering to look at mycotoxins. It's incredible to me. We see it all the time where people have mycotoxin exposure. They address the mycotoxin exposure, they get better. They have another leak, new mycotoxin exposure, they get worse again. And yet, everyone's so really, no, we don't believe it, we don't believe it, we don't believe it. And then too little, as I mentioned, with the energetics and neurotransmitters and neurotrophins. So what's really intriguing is you can now see why people got this. So when I see somebody, I look at what happened to them. What are all the things that changed their network function? And let's fix those. And it used to take, when I started back in 2012, after this, as you mentioned, this patient got better, I started saying, okay, we're going to put this together. We're now beginning to understand it. Interestingly, this makes sense of all the little observations that people had never explained before. It tells you why the incredible disparate risk factors. I mean, menopause, too low vitamin D, living in a moldy building, sleep apnea. What the heck do these things have to do in common? It tells you what they do have in common and why the problem. All of these things you have to look at. The good news is you can take it slowly. You don't have to do it, immediately. Take it over time, add here, keep going, keep tweaking. As I always say to people, keep optimizing, and things keep getting better and better. So it's really telling us a framework. And so it took me 2.5 hours per person to derive the little protocol. Now we can do it on a computer in, a few microseconds. So that was the idea of these recode reports. And that's the future, to be able to now bring in all the imaging, bring in all the genomics, all this stuff. And it will make it so that this will basically be your helper that can help you to get best outcomes.
So tell us again the three things, but if you could say it like for the audience, so we understand the bad things. Tell us the three things that we need that we're not getting.
Yes. Great point, because most of us are not getting enough of these things. So the three big ones these are the three big groups. Number one, energetics. And that means you've got to have blood flow, which is why people, lying around have a bigger problem. People with vascular disease have a bigger problem. People with ongoing inflammation, damaging their blood vessels, getting microthrombi, long COVID. COVID scares me to death for the future of Alzheimer's, because we already know that people get brain fog with it, and it is going to increase your risk. And that's already been published by epidemiologists. It increases the risk. So we're concerned down the road. So energetics, oxygenation, sleep apnea, big issue, mitochondrial function. So things that have damaged your mitochondria, you've got to support those mitochondria. And then your ketone and glucose levels so it's interesting. Your brain burns glucose and it burns ketones. Those are the two things it burns. And so you should be able to switch back and forth. Now you're sleeping, you're going to be burning more ketones. Now you wake up, you're going to be burning more glucose, and you're going back and forth. What happens to so many people, they lose both. Most of the people that I see with cognitive decline cannot burn either one. They can't burn the glucose because they have insulin resistance. So their insulin is sitting at 15 or 20. And interestingly, what is a PET scan? The Alzheimer's PET scan shows you reduction in glucose utilization in the temporal parietal regions. It's showing you the problem. Now, the thing is, you'd say, well, what about ketones? Well, as long as your insulin is high, it prevents your body from making ketones. So when I see people, I consider it an energetic emergency. Your brain is sputtering. And so this is why at the beginning, I like to use exogenous ketones for the first couple of months, just to get that energy boost in there. And Professor Stephen Kinane from Canada has shown us that even ketones alone can be helpful to people with MCI. So energetics, the big one, and it's those things we just talked about. The second one is neurotrophic activity. So the things that are trophic and support your brain, and those are three groups. That is the actual tropins themselves, BDNF, NGF, things like that. And your BDNF goes up when you exercise. Your BDNF goes up when you take whole coffee fruit extract, things like that. There's some peptides that make your BDNF go up, things like that. You need that growth support to go up. The second thing is your hormonal status. So if you are low on all these, this is why we coined, atrophic for type 2 Alzheimer's. These are people that are low in all their hormonal support. These things, again, nourish your brain. And then the third piece here is neurotransmitters. If you've got other things going pretty well, but you have no acetylcholine, you cannot make memories very well. And in fact, if you look at the brain of a patient with Alzheimer's, what do you see? A marked reduction in acetylcholine. It's the critical one for plasticity. And most of us are getting too little. You should get about 450 to 550 milligrams of choline per day. And most of us are getting about 300. So it's why people eat organ meats like liver and good pastured eggs can be another good approach. And there are other things you can have as well. And that's why acetylcholine is helpful. That was developed at MIT by Professor Wertman. Again, a good idea. So those are, the neurotransmitters are key also for that triad. So you basically have a triad of the bad guys, a triad of the good guys, and they're kind of fighting with each other.
Sure.
I kind of picture like Jackie Chan, or I picture before him, Bruce Lee. They would be surrounded by, 10 guys that are trying to take them out. And they got to kind of go, and we're doing the same thing. We got all these things that are trying to take us out. But the good news is you don't have to be as fast as Bruce Lee or Jackie Chan. All you have to do is take it slowly, add a little here, do this, keep tweaking, keep improving. And then what happens, you keep each of these things at bay, and then you start rebuilding the network that has been reduced.
Amazing. Now, I know that, and I have a million more questions because I know there's new technology. We're going to talk about that as well. But a lot of people think that Alzheimer's and dementia are an old person problem. But I would imagine that we need to talk to our younger friends. Tell me about, when should we start thinking about this?
I've always said everybody who, as they turn 40, should get a cognoscopy. Just like when we turn 50, we get a colonoscopy. And actually, my wife and I did his and hers colonoscopies on Valentine's Day, just to get it over with, and then so we could then kind of go out to lunch and relax and laugh about it. But the reality is, a paper just came out a couple days ago that scared the heck out of me. And here's the paper. What they did was, they took people between 18 years old and 25 years old. And they then separated them into ApoE3/4, so just single copy of ApoE4, which is the one we associate with cognitive decline when you're 50, 60, 70. And then they took ones that were 3/3s, no change in their risk. And then what they did was they gave them each a memory test. Then they had half of each group do exercise for 30 minutes and half not do the exercise. What they were trying to show is exercise helps your memory. What they ended up finding, which shocked everybody, is that the ApoE4s clearly did worse than the ApoE4 negatives, just 18 to 25 years old. So that really, as I say, that really bothered me. Now, we know a lot about ApoE4 and what it's doing now. We studied that in the lab for years and showed that it does change the programming of your cell. ApoE4 is the primordial ApoE. So for 96% of our evolution as hominids, we've all been ApoE4/4. Just in the last 220,000 years, ApoE3 appeared, and then just in the last 80,000 years, ApoE2 appeared. And they are less pro-inflammatory. But if you are in a pro-inflammatory place, if you're living in a third world, you are going to do more poorly as an ApoE4 negative because you're not as good. If we came down from the trees 5 to 7 million years ago with the birth of the hominids, instead of being simians, we were now hominids. You're walking along the savannah, you're puncturing your feet, you're fighting with your brethren, you're fighting with your food, all this stuff. You need a pro-inflammatory state to deal with this stuff. It doesn't, again, this is antagonistic pleiotropy. It doesn't matter that it might hurt you when you're 50 or 60. You need to
You're going to survive.
Exactly. And so it was an advantage to have this pro-inflammatory gene, ApoE4. Now, in the first world, it's no longer an advantage. And because now we're living in a situation where inflammation is not as helpful. And of course, the problem is we're making the inflammation worse with things like ultra-processed food and high-carb diets and living in homes full of mold food and things like that, where you've got all these inflammatory things. And now you've got this gene, ApoE4, that is giving you a hyper response to this inflammation. And so what that means is when you are developing this change that ultimately is called Alzheimer's, you are having this hyper response. It's a chronic innate immune system encephalitis. That's what's the inflammatory component of this that is driving this network insufficiency. I was shocked to see that you can pick up changes in 18 to 25-year-olds. And it tells me, so now I'm trying to figure out, where do we reset this cognoscopy? I think the probable answer is you reset it for 30, and you live with the fact that most people, these people didn't have any symptoms at 25. They're going to do fine. What we know is when you develop Alzheimer-related dementia, you go through 4 phases. You have an asymptomatic phase, which typically is occurring in your 30s and 40s. You then have an SCI phase, which lasts for about 10 years, where you know something isn't right. It's interesting. It's what people have always said, oh, you're just getting a little older. No, you're developing a problem for the future, and you should jump on it now. So that's SCI, average 10 years. It's, you know something's wrong, but you're still able to score normally on cognitive testing. We can make 100% of those people better. And yet people never come in at that time. And when they do come in, the doctor tells them, you're just getting a little older. The third phase is MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And I think it's a horrible term. It's too bad that people chose to call it mild cognitive impairment. Because as one patient said, there's nothing mild about it. Now you are not scoring normally on cognitive tests, but you're still able to take care of yourself, activities of daily living still intact. You can still drive. You can still balance your checkbook, all that. When you now start to having trouble taking care of yourself, that's the fourth and final phase, which is, as you know, dementia. And that's just downhill, downhill, downhill. So if you look at those early phases, if we could just get people to come in for prevention or SCI, there would be very little dementia. It's the fact that everybody's waiting for this so late that's really hurting them.
And then what would be implemented is lifestyle modification.
And finding do you have a pathogen? So the good news is you can look and you can say, and we see this all the time, where someone will say, well, oh gosh, we find Babesia. Oh, I had a tick bite 10 years ago. I got treated for Lyme. Yeah, but they didn't treat the Babesia. So now you're having this problem. And the good news is when you treat those early ones, you can just do some of the basics to begin with and then recheck and see how they do. And what typically happens is they'll improve for a few years, and then they'll start having a secondary decline. Boom, you go in, you find, here's the pathogen, here's the toxin, whatever. Now you do that. We had a woman recently who had MCI with a MOCA of 24, and she went to a perfect 30 on doing the right things. Everything was great for 6 years. After 6 years, she started clearly, so what is wrong? She's clearly going downhill again. So, okay, reevaluate. She had 3 things. Number 1, she turned out she had very significant sleep apnea that had been missed earlier on, and maybe partly because it had gotten worse because she's now in new inflammagens. Second, she had a new roof leak, which was her new exposure to mycotoxins. And the third thing, interestingly, she actually had a chronic sinus infection from Cryptococcus laurentii, which is an uncommon one. Those 3 things were treated. Boom, right back up. And interestingly, she got better than she had been when she was doing well, because now holding those things at bay before, then she was no longer able to hold them at bay. Now she gets those treated. She's doing better than ever. And she's now 7 years doing great.
They just did a study also for H. pylori and H. pylori is so ubiquitous. Everyone has H. pylori, and we're not even talking about the increased risk for Alzheimer's.
Right.
If there was ever a reason to go get your endoscopy and get treated, then do that.
So no question. And again, this just tells us all we can age better. We can do better with chronic health. And so I think that there's so much to be done.
Why do you think that mainstream is just not buying this?
Yeah. I think about that a lot. I've been surprised at how bad the pushback has been. Oh my gosh. People on X, calling me a charlatan, and any of the patients, it's just so funny. They never talk about.
I've given up. Everyone calls me a quack. I just keep quacking. It's fine.
Yeah, it's amazing. So what I realized is very few people will ever make a decision that is not in their own best interest. So if they're sitting on a board or something, or they're running a foundation, they're not going to do something that makes a change if it's going to lose them prestige or funding or anything. And so everyone's just, they want to hold with what they do because, this is what we've got going. It's really about once you have, quote, succeeded, you will do anything to keep that success. It doesn't matter how many people die, which is so sad to me.
It's so true.
Oh my gosh. I've learned so much about human nature by studying Alzheimer's disease. We've had a few people now where there will be a very, very wealthy person who has clearly had some dementia. And the family members will say, we want the inheritance, so we don't want to do anything.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, I mean, now they don't say it in those terms, but you say, look, you're going to have to do this and this. Like, no, we don't want to do any treatment. It's very clear what's going on, and it's very sad what's going on. I think that what's going to change is people will ultimately come to the realization that dementia should be a rare problem. And there's so much that can be done to prevent people from getting that far along. And right now, the mindset is this happens every day. It happens to a lot of us. There's nothing you can do about it, so don't think about it.
And so if someone wants to do something about it, where do they go?
So yeah, again, there's a tremendous amount. So where they go is can go to drbredesen.com. They can go to mycognoscopy.com. They can look at some of the books. So published 3 books. The End of Alzheimer's Program, First Survivors of Alzheimer's. There's a lot to be done. The other thing that I like, Julie G., one of the people who's an ApoE44 and who had issues, she's now over 12 years improvement, doing great. And a number of others started a wonderful website called apoe4.info. So if you find out that you're ApoE4 positive, and that's 75 million Americans have a single copy, 7 million Americans have 2 copies, and they are at a higher risk. In fact, a paper was just published last week claiming that if you have 2 copies, you are 100% going to get Alzheimer's. I think that's because they're not looking at people who did the right thing, who got on active prevention. So I look forward to being able to show that, look, all these people can do very, very well if they do the right things.
So they could go online. Do they make an appointment at a clinic? What happens? What do they do?
Great point. Yeah. One of the issues was, look, this is so common. Over 1 million people have died now from COVID-19, and yet the pandemic is dwarfed by cognitive decline. Over 45 million of the currently living Americans will die of Alzheimer's disease if we don't do something about it. So we trained over 2,000 physicians and healthcare professionals from 10 different countries and all over the U.S. So you can just literally go on. I've been really appreciative of Apollo Health because they've been great about the computational side. This is some guys who came from Apple, and they do a great job. And so you can go on apollohealthco.com and just look up, where's a doctor near me who has been trained. And we encourage everyone, please, get on prevention, get on early treatment. You don't have to wait until it's late. I hear horror stories all the time about someone who went. In fact, I was talking to a guy just a few days ago who has fairly significant changes. And, we're hoping that we're going to be able to help him. But what I said to him was, look, this has been going on. By the time you have dementia, you're typically, you've had 20 years of biochemical changes, and that's been well proven. You went through SCI years ago. You went through MCI. What happened? I said, didn't you go see a doctor, 10, 15 years ago? He said, I did. And the doctor told me it's just normal aging.
Yeah, you're.
It's
because the tests and the neuro exam, they're you have to be really far gone to fail those tests.
That's the problem. Yes. They are for dementia. They're not for the upstream. This is where these new tests, and I'm really excited about this highly sensitive p-tau217. And so a group called Neurocode has done a great job of putting together the most sensitive test for p-tau217. I'm getting it myself. I just got the thing mailed to me, so I'm going to go get that. So you can get these things done easily. You can get most of these tests at Quest. You can this particular one with a mobile phlebotomist. It's easy to do. And so we should all know where we stand. And so what I'm suggesting to people is, look, get checked at 35, 40, 45, 50. Every 5 years, find out where your p-tau217 is. And of course, if you're having any early symptoms, when you're noticing changes, something is up. And get in, get evaluated, and don't ever let it get to dementia.
Absolutely. I tell my patients all the time, brain fog is your check engine light. It's something that's wrong. Do not ignore it. It's not going to go away. So you just wrote another book, or it's pre.
Yes, I'm actually finishing writing it right now.
Amazing.
And it's all about brain aging. It's ageless brain. It's all about how these diseases that we were just talking about that are so closely related. I've been calling them Siamese cousins. So they're not exactly Siamese twins, but they're Siamese cousins. They're closely related to each other. So brain aging itself and Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Lewy body, etc., because the things that drive them are similar. I would say the one obvious difference is anytime you are triggering your innate system, it's going to be responding with amyloid. The amyloid is trying to help you by sequestering, surrounding, and killing insults. Like it actually kills fungi, it kills spirochetes, it kills bacteria, it kills viruses. It's a remarkable antimicrobial. This was discovered at Harvard several years ago by Dr. Robert Moyer and Dr. Rudy Tanzi, and I think they're absolutely on the right track. They're showing that this stuff that we have vilified, it's interesting, it's ironic, because Rudy was one of the ones who was really involved with showing how bad amyloid was for you, the so-called amyloid cascade hypothesis. Then here he is doing work like, wait a minute, this is also protecting you. So, but that actually fits perfectly what was on my yellow pad 15 years ago. It's saying that this is impacting your network. It is saying to you, okay, Dr. E, you have got to make your network a little, you got to shrink your network a little, because we're going to put more of your resources into fighting insults. And you know, it's really intriguing to me. You see this again and again and again. Everything from the molecular level to the network level to the organismal level. You have these mode switches. So we switch from awake to sleep. And you do certain things very well when you're awake, and you do certain things very well when you're asleep. Well, we realize there's another mode switch: connection, protection. You can see it all the way down at the level of amyloid precursor protein, but you can also see it all the way with your brain, etc. So what happens is, when things are good, you got the good guys high and the bad guys low. You are in connection mode. You make SAPP alpha and alpha CTF from your APP, and that's fueling new memories, fueling new synapses, maintaining the ones you have. You notice, you feel good. You learn new things like, wow, I'm sharp today, that side. The same brain then recognizes, uh-oh, bad guys are up, good guys are down. We have to go into a mode of pulling back. So we're now going to put our resources into fighting these problems. And that's why you're making the amyloid. The amyloid is killing these insults. So now you're recognizing this as brain fog. Something's wrong. Well, you're on the wrong side of that. So we want to bring you back to the good side of that, where you're now making them again. And another piece of this, of course, is the whole stuff that Annie Hopper has developed with DNRs, which I've always been very positive about biochemistry and very negative about telling yourself that everything's okay. It's like, okay, that's not scientific. But it turns out that is part of this network.
Yeah, the self-talk.
Turns out, your limbic system, your amygdala, etc., are telling you things are not good. So you are saying, I got to pull back. And until you fix that, chronic stress threat feeling, your nervous system's not going to cooperate in getting you back into a constructive mode. So I give her great props for this. And of course, Dr. Neil Nathan. And I think Neil just came out with a fabulous book, which is called The Sensitive Patient's Healing Guide. Now, I didn't have anything to do with that book. I didn't write any of it. I get nothing from it. I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful book. So I really appreciate that Neil wrote this with Annie and with other people to show. With Jill Krista is another one who wrote it with him, all looking at what we need more of, which is to recognize when people are sensitive to chemicals, to EMFs, to stress, to threat, to the things that are giving you Alzheimer's. What's going on there, and what do you do to fix that?
It was Neil who introduced me to DNRS. He said, because I work with him on some clients for mold detox, and he said, your patient's not going to get better until you fix this part.
Yep.
And so whether it's Gupta or Annie Hopper's work, because they're stuck in this stress mode. So interesting that even though you recognize stress as one of the pillars, it took you a while to be like, and therefore we should also do the work on it, right? It felt a little woo-woo for you, but that
it was as a
long time to get there too.
Woo-woo. And yet, so my question for you is, did you see good results from using that approach?
My clients, my patients who are really the most resistant clients, especially mold, and at this point, let me say this, I won't even start a mold protocol unless they're either on DNRS or with Gupta, or at the very least like the Apollo Neuro. I'm not affiliated with them either. But they must be doing some CNS or some amygdala work at the same time as we start the protocol, because I discovered that otherwise we hit a wall.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, so I do it concurrently. Usually they're so sensitive anyway that I can't start them on the mold protocol right away. I'm dealing with their MCIS and trying to calm down their system, so it's a good time to work on that. But they will start telling me that they're improving even before we started the protocol, the
Yeah.
mold detox, because
Isn't that
just
interesting?
getting out of this intense mode. But when I try to reverse, before Dr. Nathan told me about this, when I tried it the other way, I was not as successful as when we do it this way. And I let them know it's a journey. You have to trust this journey.
Well, and so part of science is data, right? So, so my argument is whatever works, whatever is going to get you the best outcomes. And what's interesting is now that we understand what's driving the problem, we can keep making incremental improvements in outcomes. And so, as people find certain things that are working better, we can keep doing better, better, better. But as long as you have a model that is inaccurate, you're always kind of chasing, something that's not real. And so maybe if we remove more amyloid, oh, maybe we do this, maybe we do that. It just doesn't work. And so I always challenge the critics. Look, I say, you line up all the people you've made better. We'll line up all the people we've made better, and then we'll look at the two lines. It should be kind of obvious.
This medication, it's so funny what you said about the clinical studies, that the medications, they want to hone on one part of the pathway and hone in on that, and they think that's going to make a difference. But it's amazing that the clinical trial was rejected because you wanted to do too many things. That is just, it explodes your mind.
Yeah. It's just there's not an appreciation that that's the way the human body works.
It's multifactorial. Is there anything that you want to tell our audience that I forgot to ask you?
Couple of quick things. So I mentioned the p-tau 217. Great idea for all of us to know that. Second, everyone should know their ApoE status, because if you're ApoE4 positive, I always tell people, don't worry about it. There's no problem. We want to get you on some active prevention. There is a new first program in the world for neurodegenerative disease with precision medicine protocols, what we started basically 12 years ago, which is at Pacific Neuroscience Institute. And so very excited about that. The founder of the institute, Dr. Dan Kelly, who's a neurosurgeon, and Dr. David Merrill. I do think there's going to be an interesting story with respects to psychedelics. Again, this is something I was highly skeptical of. Like, come on now, everybody just wants to try a little of that. But what's interesting is the science of it is it does increase neuroplasticity. And of course, that is part 3 of DNRS, is basically redirecting things. So I do think that there will be, and we'll see over time, there will be a situation where you've now done all the right things. You've kind of got people plateaued, but you need now to get them to go to that next level. And so you're going to need to increase the plasticity. And I do think there will be time will tell. So I think it's important for people to understand this is a golden era. And please don't wait. Get in. Very few people should ever get dementia.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Don't go anywhere because I'm going to stop recording, but I want to talk to you. I cannot thank you enough for being here. And I'm going to put every single thing that you said in the link for our audience to go to. And at the very least, go on Amazon and buy this book. It's life-changing. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to talk to you, Dr. E. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.